Hello, 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 and welcome to another episode of the CanIOwn Podcast. I am your host, Art Veal, and today we'll be discussing something that hardly ever comes up, but I see it as a growing problem in the rental markets, especially here in Chicago, where I'm from. And that is when should you do a background check on your landlord? I know that might sound odd, but in this day and age, sometimes that is necessary, and I'll explain in just a second. So, in this podcast, in this market, I should say, I've seen a very disturbing trend, and it's been going on for a couple of years, and I've noticed it more and more, and it's even showing up in eviction court. Some of the times that I've gone to eviction court, and that is a tenant moves into a rental and they do everything that they're supposed to do. They make their payments. The person maintains the property, and they're doing everything they're supposed to do. The landlord collects the payments and everything else. Everything seems fine. And then all of a sudden, one day, the tenant is at home and they get a knock on the door, and it's the sheriff or it's a process server saying that they're serving papers to the owner because the owner is in foreclosure. And the tenant's kind of taken back, and they give them the papers and tell them to, give them to the owner or whatever. And so the tenant calls the owner, and the owner says, "Oh, I'll come pick him up," or, "Well, don't worry about it. That's nothing," or whatever. And in some cases, I've seen the foreclosure go all the way to sale where the property is sold, and the bank goes through the eviction process on the tenant, and the tenant shows up in court and they tell the judge, "Look, I've paid my rent every month that I'm supposed to. I've done everything I'm supposed to. And this guy didn't pay the mortgage company. What am I supposed to do?" And the judge basically tells them, "Well, you should move because you can't stay there because the bank now owns it." And in a couple of cases, I've seen the bank work out something where the tenant can stay for a little while. But in most cases, the tenant loses everything. They've put money into the place. They're forced to move. And because of the fact that the landlord lost the property, they can go after the landlord for their security deposit in civil court. But if you're already out of money to move and find another place and put together money for a security deposit, it's going to make it very hard to put more money together to go to civil court to try to sue an old landlord who's going to claim bankruptcy or claim he doesn't have it, or whatever he's going to claim. So there's a very slim chance of not winning in civil court. You'll probably win in civil court, but actually collecting the money that you're owed is much harder in civil court. And so this is a growing concern with a lot of tenants, and it's something that you want to protect yourself against. And it's not very clear how you can protect yourself. So I have a couple of tips that will help you to protect yourself if this situation ever comes up. Now, this can happen. This happened a lot when the market crashed because there were a lot of landlords that were renting out property and the payment adjusted and they could no longer make the payment. So they just basically collected the rent until the wheels fell off. They collected the rent until the bank took the property. So I'm going to give you some tips on how you can protect yourself against this. So going into this, the first precaution you can take in this scenario is before you actually move in. Let's say you've gotten everything put together, you've gotten approved for your place. There's a little check you can do, and it might sound a little bit complicated in the beginning, but it's really not. And it only takes a few minutes. Usually you can do it on your computer or with a quick, depending on where you live, you can do a quick run to the county clerk's office. What you can do is you can go down to the county clerk's office or go to the county clerk's website, and you can look for the address of the property that you're moving into and check and see if there's any foreclosure filed on that address. Now, if in most cases you're going to need the tax PIN number for that property, but usually you can look up the tax PIN number pretty easily, or you can call the tax office of your county and get the PIN number for that house and then give it to the clerk's office and just find out if there's any pending foreclosures or anything like that on the property. Um, if there is a pending foreclosure on the property. Now, if it's something from, let's say, 5 or 6 years ago, I wouldn't worry about it. But if it's a pending one, let's say within the last 12 to 24 months, I would definitely, it would definitely raise a red flag. And in all honesty, I would contact the owner and ask. And I would say, hey, I was doing a little bit of research on the place I'm moving into, and I don't want to put myself in a bad situation. I noticed that there's a foreclosure on the property. You know, is that being taken care of? And if they say, yeah, that's being taken care of, or how dare you, I can't see them getting mad about it, because if they get mad, that's a red flag, because, it is what it is. And, you want to know, you're trying to protect yourself. You're not worried about hurting their feelings. You're trying to protect yourself. And you can usually ask that, what I would suggest is using, if that's the case, telling them you want to get some kind of proof from them that the property is not in foreclosure. They can, give you something from the bank. They can, get a letter from the bank or something like that stating that the property isn't in foreclosure, or get whatever they suggest they can give you to show that the foreclosure has been, satisfied and that everything is okay. But I think it's well within your rights to ask for something if you find that information out. So that's not very hard to do. It usually takes a web search or a phone call, and you want to check with the county clerk's office of whatever county you're living in or moving into. And you just want to get the tax PIN number from the tax assessor's office. Sometimes you need that, sometimes you don't. And you can either call in, or you can go into the clerk's office, or you can sometimes do it online. It takes about 5 minutes, and you can just go in and ask questions. And if you go in to the clerk's office, they're very helpful in most cases, and they'll, as long as you're polite, they'll, help you along to find out. So that's the thing you can do before move-in. These kind of situations are very hard to predict or find out about, because you're kind of shielded from what's going on with the property from the owner. So you have to take some proactive steps. But believe me, it's well worth it, because if something happens and things go south, you're much better protected if you are aware and, checking behind yourself. Now, once you're in the property, there's a couple of things you can do. It's much harder to protect yourself because you're already in the property, you're already living there. The first thing I would suggest is, if you ever get a knock on the door by the sheriff or something and you're told that the property is in foreclosure, do not ignore it. Contact your landlord immediately. Tell him, he's probably going to say it's taken care of, it's okay. Then tell him that you are going to, make your rent payment, but you're going to need some kind of proof within the next 30 to 60 days that the situation has been rectified. And if he cannot give you that, then you're going to terminate your lease and you're going to move. Now, the reason I say that is because, depending on the state you're in and the process for foreclosure, in Illinois, for example, a foreclosure can take anywhere from 9 to 24 months to actually complete. And that's if the bank is moving at a good speed. Sometimes they're very slow. So, you want to protect yourself. And just because they're in foreclosure doesn't necessarily mean they're going to lose the property. A lot of times landlords can work something out with the bank. They can do a loan modification and all kinds of things. But you want to know that they're being proactive in doing something so that you don't get displaced. And if you don't feel comfortable with their answers, then you have a right to prepare yourself and move and do what's best for your family, because of the fact that, you're not secure there. You'd hate to, in the middle of the winter, you hate for them to lose the property, and then you have to move in the middle of the winter or at a time that's really inconvenient for you. So you want to be on top of that. The next thing I would suggest is to get landlord protection insurance. There's actually an insurance out that you can get, and it's very affordable, that will cover moving cost and a security deposit if your landlord loses the property to foreclosure, and you're forced to move. So you can check into a landlord protection policy and get something to protect yourself. It's like I said, it's usually a couple of bucks a month, if that. You get it when you start your lease, and it's for 1 year, and it protects you against that exact kind of scenario. So that's something you might want to consider. Another thing you might want to do is, while you're living in the property, if you suspect anything funny like this is going on, then you can do the same county record search that I told you about earlier. You can do that same search while you're living in the house. And if there's a foreclosure in the last, year, 6 months, something like that, make the same phone call. Hey, Mr. Landlord or Mrs. Landlord, I noticed that the property came up as a foreclosure, and I'm concerned because I live here. So can you, what are you doing about it? And then if they say, hey, I've got it taken care of, don't worry about it, then you can say, that's great. Can you please give me some kind of proof that you're taking care of it, or you've taken care of it, so that I can feel comfortable? And, give them the same ultimatum. If you can't give me any proof, then I'm going to have to make arrangements to prepare to move, and because I can't put myself at risk. At least that way you're controlling the situation, as opposed to letting the situation happen to you. And finally, some of the things you want to keep in mind is that, like I said, with the foreclosure, just because a foreclosure is filed on the place doesn't necessarily mean that the landlord is automatically going to lose it. They could work out a plan, a repayment plan with the bank, and all these kind of things. So you want to talk with your landlord. A good sign is if your landlord is staying in touch with you when you're asking about this. If your landlord immediately says, don't worry about it, that's not your business, and hangs up or won't take your calls, then that might be a red flag, and you need to make arrangements to prepare to move someplace else. But if they're staying in touch with you and talking with you and kind of, understanding that you're concerned, because you have a right to be concerned. This is the place you lay your head every night. And I've had some really bad horror stories with tenants that I had a woman that came to us, and she moved in. Luckily, we were able to help her move into a house, but she came in and she came from out of town. She moved into a house that she found online. She moved in, paid her security deposit and everything else, paid her first month's rent. 2 weeks after she moved in, she came out to the house, and her stuff had been placed in the front yard, and there was a padlock on the door. The owner had already lost the house to foreclosure and illegally rented her the house, and then took her money and ran, and knew that he didn't own the house or wasn't going to own it in the next couple of days. And she literally called from a hotel, and she didn't have any family here, and all of her stuff was out on the street. So there are some horrific stories of situations, and this is not a single story. This is not the only time that something like this has happened that I've been privy to hear this information. So you want to be aware this is a real thing. The other thing you want to do is, if you're going to have to move suddenly, you don't know what kind of review your landlord is going to give you about, how you've been living in the property. They're frustrated that you're leaving. So you want to keep a record. It's very important that you keep records of every payment that you make to your landlord. I usually would suggest that you make payments. If this situation happens, make payments by money order, and keep a copy of all the money orders in a folder along with your lease. If nothing else, when you're going to a new place and applying, and you can say, hey, I'm not paying rent at the place that I'm in, but here's my rent payment checks showing that I made payments until I found out he was in foreclosure and he was losing the house. And then I stopped making payments so that I could move. And you can show that payment history. And so that would go a long way with getting into another place. And finally, if all else fails, your landlord won't talk to you about this situation, I would prepare to move, because it's going to, if it gets to a point that the bank gets control of the property, and when the bank gets a foreclosure, they automatically get an eviction. So they will have control of the property, and they're not going to want to hear your sob story. In most cases, they're going to say that's too bad, and you should have, they actually put it on you, like you should have did something differently, even though it wasn't your fault. So you want to prepare to move if all else fails and the landlord won't address these concerns. So I realize this is a little bit of a grim podcast, but it is some necessary information for you to know, so you can protect yourself, so you can make the best choices for yourself when you're renting a place. Hopefully, this never happens to you and you never have to use any of the information on this podcast, this particular podcast. But it's better to know and be prepared and prepare yourself than not know. So again, this is Art Veal signing off for the Can I Own podcast. I wish you the best. I hope that everything works out for you. And if you have questions, comments, concerns, things that you're not sure about this podcast, by all means leave a comment in the comment section below, and I'll be sure to respond. Until next time, I wish you the best and happy living. Have a great day. Bye-bye.